This is Native's very first Creators Collection figure and one of my very first Grails. She came out in 2009, went up in value, and for the past 9 years I've owned her, has held steady at that value. And for the longest time, I was convinced that this was Native's very first figure. However, almost a year and a half ago when I was planning on doing a dedicated video of this figure, during my research, I found out that there's another figure that predates the launch of this by 2 months. Yet, nobody wants this figure, it's decreased in value to an insultingly cheap price, and myself included saw this figure many times and completely ignored it. I didn't want it. That is, until I found out I didn't in fact have Native's very first figure, and as an avid Native collector, I suddenly wanted it. So let's back up in time to February 2023 when we went to Japan for Wonderfest. At this point in time, I knew this information and I was looking for her, and I couldn't find her anywhere. Annoyingly, I've been collecting for 13 years, and about 12 of that been collecting Native figures, and I had seen this figure over and over and over again and always ignored it. And of course, as soon as I go back to Japan to look for it, I can't find it. Fast forward to December 2023, so the end of that year, still cannot find this figure anywhere. But finally, on my last trip to Japan in April 2024, so just last month, I found her. And of course, I purchased her, and we're going to unbox her today in this video. Today, this is Storytime with Senpai, and we're going to go through my journey of collecting Native figures and what led me to get this Grail here, how much I paid for her, how much her current value is, and then we're going to segue to Native's actual first figure that has no value whatsoever. We're going to talk about how much I paid for it. We're trying to figure out why it's worth so little. And all of this research took me through about 2 hours of hentai that, of course, I'm going to summarize and share with you. If you're new to this channel, I'm Senpai, and together with my Kohai, we specialize in doing in-depth reviews of anime figures. If you like that kind of content and discussions like this, please subscribe. Quick content disclaimer, this video is not 18+, it's not going to contain any nudity. I do promise in the future to release a separate 18+ video of this figure so you can appreciate her in all her glory. But the content of this video is definitely not safe for work, especially some of the visual aspects like you see right here in front of me. And of course, particularly as we get to discussing the hentai, is going to have content very much of a sexual nature and sexual language to that. So just be careful. So with that, let's dive right in. To start us off, let's make sure we are all on the same page here. I really like to be inclusive of everyone, especially new collectors. Today, we're talking about a company called Native, and to me at least, they are the premier 18+ anime figure company. The name Native is actually a portmanteau. It's 2 words, naked and creative, combined to make Native. Native used to be a singular brand by itself, but like many companies nowadays, has many sub-brands underneath it, and in fact there are up to 13 of them. Some of the popular ones you might recognize quickly are Binding, Hot Venus, Frog, and Magic Bullets. In terms of how Native operates when it comes to figures, they do sell directly from their own website, and when they have a figure, they release it for pre-order for a certain period of time. They accept all the pre-orders during that window. When they close it, they fulfill those orders, then never produce the figure again. Because of that, Native figures tend to do pretty well in the secondhand market because there's a very limited supply, and depending on how much people wanted the figure at that time, kind of dictates how hard it can be to get them. And since the beginning, a pre-order bonus for these figures has always been an illustrated postcard of the source artwork like you can see here. Since the beginning of Native, only a small number of figures actually don't have a postcard. I bring this up because the postcard can directly affect the value, particularly on the secondhand market. Many collectors, such as myself, do not see these figures as complete unless they also include the postcard. This is especially true of older Native figures. If you're pursuing older figures, you're definitely coming at it from like a collector's perspective, and you're going to want to find the most complete version you can. When I'm shopping for native figures on the secondhand market, if the figure included a postcard at time of release and this doesn't have it, I will ignore it completely. Beyond just collector's sake, I enjoy always seeing the source material displayed next to the three-dimensional figure. It's one of my favorite things about figures actually, is seeing this 2D content come to life. A cool thing about Native is that their website is a complete archive of everything they've ever produced. You can go on there right now and see in chronological order everything that they've come out with, including the figures you're going to see today. Lastly, there's one more very important topic about Native we need to discuss, as it's very pertinent to this video. As we stated, Native produces 18+ figures, but they separate their figures into two distinct categories. One is called Creators Collection, and the other Character Selection. Of the two series, Creators Collection is my personal favorite to collect. So what is it? Creators Collection features only unlicensed characters, that is to say, original characters created by artists. Now, if these characters aren't even affiliated with a series, why would you even want them? It's because they're from famous doujin artists. And when I say doujin artists, yes, doujinshi covers a plethora of any fan-created content, right? But we're going to specifically focus on like 18+ ecchi comics that you'd find at Comiket. Many doujin artists get their start creating fan-made works of series that are licensed. And during Comiket, they are allowed to sell these products of licensed characters, even though they don't own the rights to it, because it's a created work. When these doujin artists get popular, they can even produce their own series that they publish themselves, or start working with a circle or a group to get them published, or small publishing companies, right? But it's all small scale in the grand scheme of things. But as you enter and navigate this world of doujins, you're going to start gravitating to certain artists, right? You might like their style, the stories they create whenever they put out fan-made works, right, of certain series, or even their own OCs. Thus, when they put out an artwork that's maybe really popular or get approached to collaborate with a company like Native, and they produce a one-off art piece, right, that turns into a 3D figure, there's a desire to own that. And it's honestly the most fun part about 18+ content, right? 18+ content has truly transformed the way I collect. It's taken, just figures to being attracted to the artist. And I think that's a really unique aspect to 18+ figures and original characters like this. So even though she is not a direct series that maybe everyone knows, she is of a famous artist and a piece of them that has been created in 3D form that we have and can collect. And to me, that's very special. Inversely, character selection is only for licensed characters. Now, they still are primarily from famous doujin artists, and this just has to do with Japan's 18+ culture, where they're allowed to kind of express those areas and where those kind of stem from. Almost all of that stems from either doujin artists or doujin artists that have grown so much that they're picked up by a real publisher and put something out like a visual novel, for example, or actual published works that ultimately become so popular they become mainstream, right? That's the ultimate goal for a lot of these doujin artists. And the character selection is where you would find those characters should they be produced by Native after they've been licensed by a company. Some examples of these that have been done in the past that you might instantly recognize would be Supersonico, Nekopara, or if you know Yaoi, Dramatical Murder. From there, even if you don't recognize them, every figure in the character selection is a licensed character, and namely from things like visual novels or hentai. Between the two series, Creators Collection or Character Selection, let's put a little bit of perspective on them. I mentioned that the Creators Collection is my personal favorite, and the majority of my collection is from that series. But I'm not the only one that shares that opinion. In fact, it's reflected on what Native produces. There are 267 figures in the Creators Collection versus the 167 figures in the Characters Selection. So it's almost a 2/3, 1/3 split. Now, there's definitely some business aspects to that, right? Licensed characters are harder to deal with because you have to pay those fees. There's less profit for Native to be in there. But in the same vein, companies follow where the money is, and if Native is successful consistently putting out creators collection sides of things, they're going to keep pursuing that side of things. So now that we're all on the same page about Native, let's dive into my journey when it comes to collecting Native figures and why this became one of my grails. I started collecting in October 2012 on my very first trip to Japan, and I brought home 3 Asuka figures that I bought on the last day. 2 of them were prizes, and 1 of them was a scale figure. Now, I don't remember the exact dates that I bought my very first Native figure, but I do have a photo from December 2013 of my collection showing that I owned 5 of them at this time. This means that within 14 months of my journey of collecting anime figures, I had already dove down the 18+ rabbit hole. My first Native figure was Hotori Yoshi, or as I colloquially call her, Gym Girl. And like I said, at the end of 2013, I owned 5 of them. Some of these are my colloquial names as well. So I own Gym Girl, Gamer Girl, Strawberry Girl, Cat Lap Milk, and Black Santa Girl. The most important thing to note here is that my very first figure was from the creator's collection. And by the end of 2013, all 5 of them were from the creator's collection. So very early on in my journey, I gravitated directly to the creator's collection. So naturally, when going through the archive that is Native's website, how could I not want to collect their very first one? Now, the exact date I bought her is not known. But once again, if I go back through kind of picture histories, I have a picture from December 2014 where I did not have her, but I have a picture from August 2015 where I do have her. So let's just assume for the sake of this video that that picture I took of her was the first day I owned her in August 2015. So that means in my figure collecting journey, it took me 1.5 to 2 years after first collecting Native figures to find my grail. And when I mean find, I legitimately mean find. At this time in my life, I was doing work for a client out in Japan, and I was going to Japan for about 2 weeks every 2 months. So this means about 10 to 12 trips it took me to find her. And the interesting tidbit of information here is that this is actually the 3rd one I ever saw. But the first 2 I saw didn't have the postcards, so I completely ignored them. If I was going to find my grail, I was going to find it complete. But before I tell you how much I purchased her for, let's go ahead and introduce her properly. The name of this figure is Kosoku Imko. Kosoku is Japanese for restraint, which you can see she's being restrained by this tentacle monster here. And Imko is actually her name. It's spelled with a capital M-Ko, or spelled in katakana with Emuko, Imko. The artist behind Imko is Akiman, who specializes in sci-fi related works. And in fact, included with this figure is a printed comic of Imko and the situation happening right here. She came out in January 2009 for 12,000 yen, and if you bought her at the time of release, that would have cost you $131.55 USD. She was a joint production with Max Factory, even though my figure collection doesn't state this, so don't always take my figure collection for being accurate, because it states this on Native's own website for this figure. When Native first got started, they definitely leaned on other companies like Max Factory to help them produce these figures. She is cast offable. You can take off all the clothing here. Normally you see a silver piece in the photos that goes over her breasts. I choose not to display it that way because when it's there, you can't spread apart her clothes revealing her breasts, which is how I personally like to display her. And that silver piece doesn't match the artwork. If you look, it's just flat out not there. You can take off all her clothes, but you cannot reveal a bare vagina. You're always going to have this gold plug inside of her. But funny enough, you do actually have a sticker sheet that includes different kinds of pubic hair that you can apply to this figure. So now let's elaborate on value. I mentioned 1, that the postcard has a lot of value to it, and 2, I mentioned that this is the third one I had ever seen, because the first 2 didn't have that postcard. First one I saw was for 27,000 yen. Second one was 32,000 yen. But I passed them up because they weren't complete. And I finally stumbled upon this one for 42,000 yen in August 2015. That converts in USD at that time to about $341. I remember that number because she was the very first figure I ever bought that breached the 40,000 yen mark. My most expensive figure at that time was the Vertex Asuka, but I got her for 36,000 yen. When I bought her, she was already 6 years old, so she had tripled in value at that time. So how much is she currently worth? If you're shopping for her in Japan, at least based on what's online, she's not available on Yahoo Auctions. She's not available on Mercari Japan. She is available on Amazon.jp for 48,329 yen. So yen-wise, she's still 4 times her initial offering. And keep in mind, these are secondhand used prices. Outside of Japan, there's an eBay listing for $429, but that's coming from a Japanese seller, and you can tell they're not really doing that exchange properly. The best place to get her right now is actually my figure collection. Just recently one sold for $325 plus the cost of shipping, and there's currently one for sale right now, complete, for $290 plus shipping. Now, real fast, if you are interested in purchasing this figure, to be complete, it must come with a comic book of this character, the postcard, and the pubic hair sticker sheet. So be sure to look out for those if you're going to go hunting for this figure. So, for almost a 16-year-old figure, yen-wise, she has quadrupled in price. When it comes to the US dollar, she's almost tripled in price. And for the 9 years I've owned her, she's basically just retained that value. The $341 I spent on her at the time is basically the same because I didn't have to pay for shipping. After the current sales go up, it's more or less a wash. I bring all this up, not for the sake of bragging or anything like that, but to show the dichotomy between what this figure has done versus what Native's actual very first figure has done, which brings us to the very fun reveal of this video. So here, of course, we have Native's very first Creators Collection figure, which has gone from 12,000 yen and quadrupled to 48,000 yen. But beside it now, we have Native's actual first figure that predates this one by 2 months of the Character Selection series. I just bought her in April 2024, complete, damage-free, with postcard, secondhand from Mandarake in Nakano Broadway. So do you have a guess of what this figure might be worth? Go ahead and think about it. Now let me feed you a little more information, right, to help formulate this. She released initially for 7,000 yen. All right, think of a new guess for what you think I paid for this figure. Now, would you believe me if I told you that I paid 4,000 yen for this figure? 4,000 yen. That converts to a whopping $26.31 for Native's very first figure they've ever produced. Officially making this, I think, the cheapest scale figure I've ever purchased. Sure, yes, I've got like some Nindroids that I've gotten for less than that and some prize figures, but scale-wise, I don't think I've ever paid 4,000 yen or 26 bucks for a scale figure. And a scale figure from Native for $26? That's crazy. So why the hell do people not want this figure? Well, let's unbox her Show her off and let's talk about it. Let's approach this from the figure perspective first. Her name is Nozomi Watase, and she was released in November 2008, predating this one by 2 months. She released for 7,000 yen, and if you bought her at the time of release in USD, that would have cost you $70.75. This figure was also produced with the help of Max Factory. Amusingly, 5 months later, in April 2009, they produced a recolor of this figure with a red outfit and black lingerie. Figure-wise, it's pretty unimpressive, but for 2008, the quality is just fine. But I think the major flaw in this figure is that it's not 18 plus. What you see right now is what you get. She's not cast off. You cannot remove or change anything. Ecchi, for sure, but not 18 plus. What I didn't realize about this figure until I unboxed it is that she too actually comes with one of Native's pubic hair sheets, so you can add pubic hair to her. And on top of that, she's really small. She's only a 1/7 scale, whereas this one is a 1/6, but even beside each other, she looks to be on a much smaller size. So what about the source material? As established, this is from the character selection series, meaning she is a licensed character. Well, this figure comes from an eroge and led me down a serious rabbit hole. The game is called Shinshou Genmukan, and it came out on December 17th, 2004. Unfortunately, it does not have an English patch, or no group has dubbed it, so I cannot play it. But fortunately for me, 6 years after the game's release and 2 years after this figure's release, they came out with an OVA hentai of 4 episodes, 16 minutes apiece. It's released by the same name, and this aired from March to September of 2010. And for science, I watched them. You typically find episodes 1 and 2 grouped together in a single video, and then 3 and 4 grouped in another. The episode opens up with Nozomi here, and it turns out she's a live-in maid for a detective agency. And the detective is our male protagonist. He's sleeping on a couch, fully clothed, but while Nozomi is walking around, she sees him sleeping on the couch and becomes so aroused that she just has to start diddling herself. So she immediately pulls up her skirt, just like this, and starts going to town. Albeit in the hentai, her breasts are actually uncovered. So this might be closer to the actual eroge artwork, like kind of we see here, if this is what was actually in the game, but hentai-wise, they stepped it up a notch. It's at this point she finishes the deed and wakes up our lead detective, and of course they start going at it. When they finish, Nozomi is of course cream-pied, and she pulls up her panties to cover up. When a new character walks in, her name is Mei. She is actually the assistant to the detective. And when she sees them together, she notices that something is dripping down from underneath Nozomi's skirt onto her shoes. Well, this, of course, gets her super aroused, right? So she has to immediately go to another room and starts diddling herself on the edge of a table. Cue Nozomi to enter, see this happening, and being the good maid that she is, she decides to help out and get her off. Now, Nozomi here is a very considerate maid, and when Mei-chan acknowledges that she's still a virgin and is saving it for the detective, Nozomi here decides to then penetrate her with her double-sided dildo into the butt instead. Afterwards, Nozomi wants to pair up Mei-chan and our detective. So she gets Mei-chan dressed up in her maid outfit and encourages her to go up to the detective, pull up her skirt, and reveal that she is not wearing anything underneath to kick that off. And of course, it's very successful. And at this point, it starts getting really confusing. So while Mei-chan and the detective are going at it, Nozomi is suddenly in a car with a strange man saying that she has to do this for the detective to figure something out that she doesn't acknowledge what it is. And when she gets to this location, of course, she's attacked and assaulted by this person, but not really assaulted because she's doing it of her own volition to get information. And then suddenly there's two more random guys who start doing things to her. And then during this course, another female enters the picture who, to save Nozomi, decides to give herself to the three men to distract them. From there, we pan to the detective and Mei again, but this time they're in a car. The detective's driving. Mei is in the back naked, sucking off some random old guy who's supposedly supplying some information to them as well. She finishes with him, and then to get the taste out of her mouth, starts once again going at the detective, who is mentioning that, oh, Nozomi's late, which is why we're going out to look for her. At this point, I'm completely fucking lost. It's 95% plot and 5% actual plot, and I have no idea what's going on, what the context is, or what they're even doing. So I go back online to see if I can find a summary. And when I'm looking for a summary, I find out that this is actually a sequel game, and there is a prequel to this. The original eroge came out 2 years prior in March 2002. And I'm going to butcher the name, so I got to look it up. It's Genmukan Ayuku to Ryojoku no Inzai, which roughly translates to the sin of desire and disgrace. And there's also a one-shot light novel that came out in October 2002. Again, though, it doesn't have an English translation, so I cannot play it. But, lucky for me, in March 2003, a year later, they came out with a 2-episode hentai of the game. It's a 2-episode hentai this time, but they are 28 minutes apiece. So of course, once again, for science, I watched it. And this time around, it's actually pretty dang good. On Mal, it has a 6.35. I mean, that's for a hentai, that's great. I've seen mainstream stuff with a worse score than that, and I've definitely watched trash that is significantly worse than a 6.35. Now, this suffers from the exact same thing where the sequel gets a higher score on Mal. If you aren't aware of that, basically only people that like the first series are going to move on to watch the second, so the second sequel is almost always rated higher. So ignore the 6.4 for the second game. The first one is actually a good hentai. The first episode is probably 70% actual plot to 30% plot. It has a great little story arc from start to finish. Second episode's maybe like 60% actual plot to 40% plot. But overall, for a essentially 2-episode, all-inclusive 1-hour series, it's solid. Animation is significantly better than the crap they put out in 2010. The 2010 one looks like dog shit in comparison to this. This is like actual cinematography, actual shading, very defined lines. This was, I guess, outsourced to another country, so it's also uncensored. The soundtrack is decent. Even the cinematography in some areas is very artistic. The sex scenes are actually good. It's real anatomy with actual real achievable sex positions. And it's not just repeating the same few frames over and over again to extend it. It's multiple different scenes with different angles, and it's quite good. I'm not going to reveal the entire plot in case some of you want to watch it, but it starts out, once again, with a detective agency and Mei-chan, who get invited to come to this mansion to help solve a mystery of where this ring has disappeared to. The master of this estate has passed on, and although there is someone in line already for the inheritance, this ring represents kind of the owner and head of the family. So the butler has hired the detective agency to find it. And while he's here, the detective stumbles upon some other things going on in the background. We do meet Nozomi, who is a maid for this estate, albeit she's a minor character. One could argue that the main interest is the daughter of the late master. And on one hand, I'm actually surprised that she didn't have a figure in comparison to Nozomi. I'm not going to reveal more to the story because there's actually some good kind of like twists that I didn't see coming, and it's a very well self-contained thing. And in comparison, after watching that and then going to continue episode 3 and 4 of the new sequel, I mean, it's awful. And yes, you need to watch the prequel to get any context for what's happening for the second series. And again, I can't reveal it, but if you watch both, you'll understand why the second series is awful. They take some things from the first series and basically just have to redo it in a sense. It very much has that feel of, hey, the first one was successful, we need money, why don't we reopen that door that's clearly closed? Like, it just screams that. The sequel has complete shit animation in comparison. It's censored, doesn't make any sense. Albeit in the sequel, Nozomi is arguably the main character. She has a ton of airtime, which must be why they produced this. Looking at the timeline of this figure, they actually did a re-release of the sequel game in October 2008, so just 1 month prior to this coming out, and this re-release was called the Special Price Edition, so I can only assume that means that they did a kind of a lower, almost like maybe like a value release of it so other people can play it 4 years after. And then it wouldn't be another 2 years after that that we get the really terrible hentai adaptation. So, all this being said, I have to make the assumption that the hentai is reflective of the eroge, right? Like, I just have to make that assumption because I cannot play it. If they follow that, Prequel significantly better in almost every way. It is a full self-contained story, and if I were to recommend someone hentai, it would probably be on my list. Like, it was not bad at all. Sequel, on the other hand, it's dog shit. It's terrible. Not good. Don't recommend it. Don't bother. And again, if they're reflective of the games, and I'm pretty sure they are given the storylines I know of each of them, and I'm being vague because I'm trying not to spoil it for people that might actually want to see the source material of Nozomi, the second storyline from the get-go is just terrible. So there's a good chance that this character, Nozomi, who is not a main character in the first one, which is actually good, just doesn't get her shot in the spotlight, right? So even the source material from this, people just might not care about. And then lastly, another aspect of this that I think hurts the value is that the artist behind this is Tony. And Tony is a very famous, prevalent artist in Japan. He's very recognizable and has a ton of figures. And we, in our collection, have a bunch of Tony figures, even some art books. But Tony figures honestly don't seem to be retaining value over time. And that's a very generalized statement, so let's just focus real quickly on native Tony figures so we can kind of see what the trends are. So let's only focus on native figures that are Tonys, and then only Tonys that we own in our collection. You can see Banana Girl here came out in 2009 for 8,000 yen, and if we scroll down, we have people on my figure collection selling her for $80. Santa Girl came out in 2009 for 12,000 yen, and we have people selling her for $80. Black Santa version selling for 12,000 yen, and recently sold for 105 pounds. We've got a Kimono Umbrella Girl who came out in 2015 for almost 15,000 yen, selling for $150. We have a really small scale Midnight Companion here that came out in 2016 for 7,000 yen, being sold for 80 euros or $62 USD with $6 shipping. Butterfly Girl here came out in 2020 for 21,000 yen, selling for 29,800 yen or 200 CAD. And then Tied Up Girl here, who came out for 28,000 yen in 2022, just recently sold for $200. So you can see, just by looking at Tony native figures, they don't tend to really appreciate in value, and if anything, in many respects, they depreciate in value. And I think that's very much reflected in the figure we see here. And they're still obtainable. We just saw a 2009 figure for $80. You can still get your hands on these. I found this just a month ago in Japan, even though it's almost 16 years old. So wrapping this up, the reason I think nobody wants this figure, first and foremost, is simply that it's not 18 plus. That is probably the main reason and main attraction here. You come to Native for 18 plus figures, why would you want to buy one that's not 18 plus? And on the flip side, this actually makes IMCO here Native's first 18 plus cast-offable figure. On top of that, the direct source material she comes from, which is the sequel game, is awful. And if you're a fan of the first series, which I now am, it just butchers it completely. And if the eroge follows that, I bet people do not care for that material at all whatsoever. If you want to purchase this character and want to know her backstory, I do highly recommend watching the prequel. She is a likable character. And then lastly, Tony figures just don't seem to retain their value well. I just showed you native ones, and I think that's reflected in this figure. And in fact, I'd go as far to say that this video is probably going to generate more interest in this figure than this has had in a long time, right? If you're watching this now, you might want to buy this because it's dirt cheap if you can find it. And it's Native's first figure. And if you collect Native figures, I still think that's pretty cool. And to me, definitely worth $26. I mean, come on, it's Native's first ever figure, 16 years old, $26 or 4,000 yen. That's absolutely insane. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I know overall it's a pretty silly discussion that we're talking about here, but I hope just like our review, something about this was informative and you got something from it. At the very least, you got to be exposed to two, in my opinions, very important figures, particularly if you are a Native fan, of which they're my absolute favorite thing to collect, and it's the reason it's one of my largest collections that I own. I'm really enjoying doing these discussion videos, and so Senpai's showroom is going to roll into these type of formats more. And those B-roll videos where I just show the figures, those are going to probably move to Reels and TikTok. So over time, you'll see more videos like these coming out as I come up with ideas for things to talk about. I'm really enjoying these longer format discussions, and I really hope you are too. Please let me know in the comments if you've even heard of this figure before, if you own this figure, or now, maybe after seeing the video, actually want to purchase it. I appreciate you all. We're so lucky to have you as subscribers. You're all friends in my eyes. I'm Senpai. Take care.